welcome. My name's Melanie Hulbert. I'm a sociology professor at Western State Colorado University, which is way up in the Rocky Mountains. We're at about 8,000 feet elevation, so I've mentioned this a couple times. I feel like I'm swimming in oxygen down here. But for the past 11 years, I've taught at George Fox. So my heart is still very much at George Fox, but I have this awesome new job where I kind of can ski anytime I want, and it's a great place. It's really interesting to be outside of Christian higher ed. And I started my career in Christian higher ed, but really this kind of new journey has taken me into a very public school, a very, large state school. And the way in which I've been able to kind of share God is in very unique ways, right? Because I can't talk about it in the classroom, but I can definitely share it in unique ways. So it's really a wonderful blessing to be there. But today I wanted to share with you a little bit of my own story and talk a little bit about this idea of whiteness and why we talk about whiteness and what that means. The title of this talk actually comes from the mouth of my child. In 2008, we were watching the election results of the presidential election, and of course it was announced that President Barack Obama had been named the new president of the United States. And at the time, I had a little 5-year-old boy. I still have him, he's just older now. And I remember him sitting there because we were all watching it and waiting to see what was going to happen. And he's sitting on the couch and I'm behind him, and he jumps up on the couch and he turns around and he looks at me and he goes, "Mom, am I white?" And I said, "Well, what do you mean, son?" He goes, "Well, his skin is brown and my skin is brown, but your skin is not brown. So what color am I? Am I white?" And I thought, oh my goodness, this is an interesting moment, right? Because to him, he's always drawn, self-portrait, he's always drawn himself he's colored himself as brown. And that's because I'm married to a man who's part Chinese, and so Aiden, my son's skin, has always been a little darker, but he realized in looking at Barack Obama that his skin was not as brown as this man. I said, "Son, what do you think you are?" That's the good thing to say, right, when you're a parent. It's like when a kid says, "So, Mom, is Santa Claus real? What do you think?" He said, "Well, I think I'm brown." I said, "Okay, we'll go with that." "Well, does he drink a lot of chocolate milk, Mom?" Talking about Barack Obama. "No, I don't know, maybe he likes chocolate milk. What do you mean?" He says, "Well, maybe if I drank more chocolate milk, my skin would be dark like that." And it goes to capture this moment when we're little, and none of that has sunk in. None of that really, we're not aware of the fact that skin color, right, has meaning in this culture. To him, it's just a color, just like my hair is blonde and his hair is black. So for him, in that moment, I didn't know to what extent I wanted to go there and sit down and say, well, let's have a sociological conversation about race right now, because technically you're not brown, but maybe, so we're not going to go there. But I realized, at what point did I figure out I was white? At what point did I figure out that I wasn't like others in my neighborhood, or wasn't like others in my school? And I wondered to what extent people of different racial ethnic backgrounds experience that for the first time. For the first time, that knowledge of, I didn't know I was blank. And so today I want to kind of go there with us, and I want to talk to you a little bit about my own journey into whiteness and what that means. And I really think it's been since graduate school which really opened up my eyes. Here's the thing. I was talking to a group of students yesterday. We weren't even talking about this stuff in undergrad. I mean, conferences like this, at least where I went to school up in Washington, Bellingham, Washington, Western Washington University. There weren't conversations about race or gender. I mean, it just wasn't happening. So it really wasn't until graduate school when I started having conversations with people about what it meant to be of a different racial ethnic group. And it was because of this, I've always kind of been able to channel my emotions. But when people started asking me questions in graduate school, questions like, "Melanie, what does it mean to be white?" I'd never been asked that before, right? Because I don't know what it means to be white. I'm just white. And I think when those issues of race came up, those discrepancies infuriated me. I kind of shared this in chapel the other day, that when I was asked to think of myself as anything other than Melanie, anything other than a woman, anything other than just a student, it made me upset because I didn't want to think that there was something different about me just because of something I had no control over. Or not even that there was something different about someone else out of something they had no control over, which perhaps was the color of their skin. And I had a friend of color come up to me one day and say, Melanie, why don't you ever say anything in class when we're talking about this? All the other white students are talking about what it means to be white. Why won't you go there? And I think what it was is I think I was afraid. And I want to talk about fear for a moment, just for a quick moment, because in recognizing that we all have a racial identity. Now remember, this was a conversation I was having years ago. So to you, this might not seem like an odd conversation and one to be afraid of, but at the time, this wasn't necessarily normal. To recognize that as a white person, I have a racial identity. Because in my life growing up, other people had racial identities. I was just white. I didn't have a connection to my racial ethnic background. I mean, I'm German, I'm Scottish, I'm a little bit of English. That wasn't taught to me as a young kid. I didn't really know what that meant. So to be thinking about that, I think it felt very fearful to talk about it because I recognized that when I really wanted to stop and think about what it meant to be white, it meant to be privileged. At least that's what people were telling me. Like, you're privileged because you're white. No, I'm not. I've worked really hard for where I am. That's where I was coming from. I think to be told you're privileged means that you feel like you're better than someone or you've been given something. And that's scary to think about if you really stop to think about it. Either that or you're like, yes, I've got privilege. I'm going to keep it and hold on to it. But to really stop and think that just because of how I was born, that I actually have privilege, really upset me. And it made me feel guilty. And so the more that I talked about this with friends and the more that I learned about this, I read a really powerful article, and I highly recommend that you read it. I'm going to give you the name of it, so you should write it down. Because it rocked my world. And it still is rocking my students' worlds. And it's by a woman named Peggy McIntosh. Have you read it? Yeah. Peggy McIntosh. It's called Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack. This article was written a long time ago, and I'm just going to admit something to you. A couple years ago, she came to a university near George Fox called Lewis and Clark. And she was a guest speaker there, and I totally stalked her. I totally stalked her because she didn't know that when she wrote that article, for the first time I recognized that even though I might not feel privileged, I am, and that's not something to feel guilty about. It's something to use. It's something to use in order to work towards reconciliation. I wanted to tell her how much she'd changed my life, and so I went to this talk, and I took a whole bunch of students from George Fox. And they were really embarrassed of me that night, I'm sure, because I said, you guys go sit up there. I'm going to go sit in the front row. Or you can come sit with me. And they're like, we're not sitting in the front row, Dr. Hulbert. Only weird people sit. I'm like, I'm sitting in the front row. So afterwards, she was done talking, and I leapt. I probably didn't leap, but I felt like I wanted to leap out of my seat, and I ran up to her. She's like this big. Okay, she's this tiny woman. She's got a bun on her head. She's just this tiny little woman. I put my arm around her, and she's looking at me like, who is this strange person? I said, Dr. McIntosh, you don't know how much you've changed my life. And she said, it's not me, right? But what have you learned? And in this article, here's what she does, if those of you that haven't read it. She says, I live in a world right now at the university she was working at where it seems to me that men and women, we all are here, we've all earned our right here in this faculty, but it seems to me that some men tend to have a little bit more privilege than women. Their voices are heard a little bit more, they're not questioned as much, and that's kind of the issue of patriarchy, which, by the way, patriarchy is not about men, it's about a system. She says, I wonder if there's something going on with white privilege. And she makes a list of all the things that she doesn't have to think about because of the color of her skin. Or some of the things that she doesn't have to encounter, she thinks because of the color of her skin. And some of those things aren't just things that she kind of realized. They were things that she learned from talking to friends of color. I want to share with you a bit of this list. She says in this article, whoops, excuse me. I don't have it with me, I just realized, but I can remember it. When I go to the grocery store and I'm looking for Band-Aids, and the Band-Aids say flesh-colored. Whose flesh color are they? When I watch television and I see that the majority of people on television look like me. When my kids swear, or when my kids wear scrappy clothes, they're never assumed that they're dressing that way or talking that way because of the color of their skin. I've never been stopped by a cop because of the color of my skin. And she goes on, she makes like 36 items. It's amazing. Now, my first reaction when I read this as a white person, I'm like, well, that's not true. That's not true. I mean, that doesn't really happen to people of color, does it? And if you're telling me that, then are you telling me that because you want me to feel guilty? And after reading it and talking about it with so many students, I realized that privilege accepted is responsibility accepted. And that part of my growth as a white person was, first of all, to recognize my own whiteness and what it means to be white. And that I have a racial identity. And that's not anything to be fearful of or to feel guilty about, because my parents didn't own slaves. They didn't intern people. My ancestors didn't do that I know of. So why do I feel this burden now? And again, in Peggy McIntosh's work, she says this is not about you feeling a burden. It's about you recognizing that there are things as a white person that you just simply don't have to think about. And that is privilege. Let's take a look at this article that I shared with you. Are there more copies? Are there any more? Here's a couple. Thank you. It is. Yeah. Great. Thank you. So this is from a book called White Privilege: Essential Readings on the Other Side of Racism by Paula Rottenberg. She says this: why talk about whiteness and white privilege? On the one hand, these topics make some people uncomfortable by seeming to take them to task for privileges they never noticed they had. And on the other, they appear to divert attention from racism and its effects, making white people the center of attention once again. But rather than providing reasons to avoid talking about whiteness and white privilege, these concerns actually underscore our need to do so. Discomfort of this kind is a sure sign that we need to continue the conversation. If education is about learning to see the world in new ways, it is bound at times to leave us feeling confused or angry or challenged, and that is a good thing. Instead of seeking to avoid such feelings, we should probably welcome a degree of discomfort in our lives and feel shortchanged if it is not present. I'm just going to read the next paragraph for now. As for the concern that looking at whiteness and white privilege will deflect our attention away from racism, this could not be further from the truth. White privilege is the other side of racism. Unless we name it, we are in danger of wallowing in guilt or moral outrage with no idea of how to move beyond them. It's easy to deplore racism and its effect than to take responsibility for the privileges some of us receive as a result of it. By choosing to look at white privilege, we gain an understanding of who benefits from racism and how they do so. Once we understand how white privilege operates, we can begin to take steps to dismantle it on both a personal and institutional level. Fear is a powerful emotion. And I think in those early moments of trying to figure out when people were challenging me to think about my whiteness, I think this is what I feared. I feared perhaps isolation from friends and family for speaking about such things as whiteness. I feared rejection by those who may be offended with what I had to say. It takes a lot as a white person to stand in front of another white person and to say to that person, we need to challenge this. We need to talk about this. I'm a little scared to do that in this room right now because I don't know you. I haven't developed a relationship with you. But what I can say is that you're here for a reason. And this is not about guilt. I mean, if you want to feel a little guilty, do it, but then get over it, right? This is about power to some extent. And I don't mean power in like power over someone. I mean the ability to move forward in God's kingdom, of really seeing what Michaela and Brennan, Chad were talking about this morning. That this benefits all of us. I think also what I feared about talking about my privilege is that I'd lose it. That my loss of privilege or status for speaking for those who've been marginalized by society, that I would lose my privilege, that I wouldn't be seen as special anymore. I have done some research for years where I've asked students in a class, I teach a class called Racism Without Racists. It's based on the title of a book by Eduardo Bonilla Silva. And I asked my students, the very first assignment that I asked them to do, and there's a mix of racial ethnic backgrounds in my class, but primarily white, where I work in Colorado. And I asked them to do this. I want you to go home, and your first assignment is to write a letter. I want you to write a letter to someone of a different racial ethnic group, and I want you to be blatantly honest. I want you to say things that you would never say out loud. I want you to say things that maybe are not politically correct, and reveal the stereotypes that you have, and say it and write it down. And some of the letters that I've collected over the past 6 years, and I've written and I've done some work with like analyzing this, the number one thing I hear from white students in these letters is, I have so much to say to you, you person of color, but I would never say it because I'm afraid you're going to think I'm a racist. I have questions about you and I have questions about the way you act, but I'm afraid to tell you what I really think because I'm afraid that you're going to think I'm racist or I'm just like one of those other white people. And I'm confused. I'm confused by you. Why don't I feel welcome why don't I feel welcome when I sit down with you at the cafeteria table? Why are you so loud, right? These are quotes, right? Why don't you learn English? We live in a country where if I moved to another country, I would learn English. These comments of fear and anxiety. And then I read the letters from the students of color. And again, these are just from the things I've collected over the years, but students of color saying, do you not know, you white person or you Hispanic person or you African American person, whatever it is, do you not know that all I want is for us to sit down and have a conversation? Because I'm scared too. And these are people that are like sitting next to each other and they're laughing and they're roommates. I don't like it when you look at me, the student of color might say. When you look at me in class, every time a professor wants to talk about racism or slavery, why do you look at me as if I know everything about it? I had one African American student say in one of his letters, why is it that every time my music professor talks about gospel music, he asks me to talk about it? I don't want to talk about it. I shared this yesterday in another talk that I gave, that there's a student at a university in the CCCU, an African American male student, who walked into the classroom just a couple weeks ago, and the professor said to him, he said, so have you talked to your parole officer today? And he said, what? He's like, yeah, did you talk to your parole officer today, as a joke? And the kid's like, I don't have a parole officer. Oh, I'm just kidding, the professor says. I'm just joking around with you, right? that professor probably didn't mean to be racist, probably didn't mean to come across that way, but you see the power in that comment. And now that student is really upset, as he should be, right? So the question is, if we were to take away all the fear and just have honest conversations, that's how me as a white person, that's how I begin to let go of my anxiety about this. And the only way that can happen is through relationships. I so agree with Chad and Michaela. Michaela said one of the first things that opened her eyes up to understanding other cultures was she met, what did she call it, some little white chick? Is that what she said in chapel this morning, right? And that relationship started something. I'm going to stop right there and just kind of hear maybe from some of you what you're thinking or ideas or thoughts or questions, concerns. Let me just kind of open it up to what you've learned about this idea of white privilege, maybe at your institutions. Yeah.
On racism without racist. Is that within like a ethnic studies or a minor or anything like that?
It's a sociology class.
Okay.
Yeah. I wanted to just call it race and ethnicity, and my colleague said, you need to have a better title. I said, okay, I'll give you a better title. Please.
So then, is it primarily then minorities, or is it primarily, is it evenly divided?
My university, as you can imagine, is primarily white, way up in the Rocky Mountains. I mean, we attract a lot of ski bums and snowboarders because we live 20 minutes from a major ski resort. So there's I would say there's about 18% diversity on my campus, racial, ethnic diversity, so it's quite low. So it makes it a challenge, right? It makes it a challenge having a class with the majority of students being white, but it matters to me, but not enough to make me not want to teach the class, because I think it's just as important for all groups of students to be aware of these things. Any other thoughts or comments? Yes, sir.
I guess it's interesting to hear you say that in your response from students of color that they desire conversation. What do you think would be a good way to approach that and engage that kind of conversation?
Yeah.
And step out and be like, hey, I'm struggling with this. Would you be willing to talk to me, kind of thing?
Yeah.
And then what would you kind of encourage the conversation to consist of?
Exactly what you just said. Exactly what you just said. I think there has to be a relationship there first and foremost, right? I mean, if someone was to come up to me and I didn't know them and said, so tell me what it's like to be white, I mean, I would be willing to go there just because I think about this stuff all the time, but it has to start with a relationship. And you have to be okay with those conversations not always working out the way you want them to work out, right? You have to be okay with those conversations feeling a bit uncomfortable or having someone be suspicious, like, why do you want to talk about this? But it's through your honesty of like, hey, I have some questions. But for whatever reason, we don't do that. It's very uncomfortable, and I think it's because your generation in particular, since you were like 2 or 3, if you've grown up in America, has been like, celebrate diversity, right? And that's a wonderful thing, right? Every week you have every year you have Cultural Awareness Week and Martin Luther King Day. But there's no like real hardcore, open, honest dialogue about what racism looks like today. And I think a lot of white people, again, I can't speak for all, but I know a lot of white folks that just don't think it's a problem anymore. Because it doesn't look like what it used to look like from those grainy videos that we watched in 7th grade. It's not a problem. I mean, look around. We have a diverse campus. For goodness sakes, we have our first African American president. By the way, he's also half white, right? So it's not a problem. Okay, so here's the thing, class. maybe it doesn't look like what it used to, but it looks different today. It's at a different level. It's that kind of micro-aggressive kind of level, right? And that doesn't, again, mean like this is a white person's problem. But it is not, it's not disappeared. And I don't experience life as a person of color. I don't know what that's like. I never will. But the more and more I talk to white students and students of color, it is still happening. And you know where it happens? It happens through jokes, and it happens through comments. And those are sometimes some of the most deadly ways in which this happens. And so it is something that's the beauty, like, we know it is an issue, so like, what can we do about it? Yes, ma'am, you had your hand up.
Yes, I was asking, I mean, you kind of alluded to it right then. What are some more tangible ways that you and your experience in teaching have heard that racism shifted? Because it's clearly not the same as those grainy videos.
Right.
So, other than conversations that I've had with friends and other people in churches and atmospheres that are of different colors than me, you've clearly had a bigger range of experiences. So what are some of those ways that racism takes place here and maybe in different parts of our country?
And I would love other students to speak into this, because that's really important. So there's this idea called racial microaggressions, and the way that the author talks about it, it's like a paper cut. You guys ever gotten a paper cut? It's like, oh, that hurts, but then it's gone, right? But think of like a paper cut that happens over and over and over again, where someone says something to you and you think, did they really just, like, did I catch that? Or was that like a joke, or was that like an insult? I don't know, I'm just gonna let it go. Or someone says something like, so what kind of like hip hop music do you like? Assuming that I like hip hop music because I'm a certain color, right? Or so I had one of my students say that a professor asked her, like, so tell me about fried chicken and watermelon. Like, again, those don't seem real micro, those seem kind of macro, but like these little kind of comments that from the white person's perspective maybe is a joke, but it's not, right? So just little comments here or there, or asking someone of color to speak on behalf of all people of color, right? It's like asking a woman, Melanie, what's it like to be a woman? I don't know. I mean, I know my experience, right? So it's little comments here and there that when we talk about racial microaggressions, they don't come across as outright overt. But what they are little subtle, kind of covert insults or put downs or attempts to kind of derail someone or to suggest that someone else has power over them. And it's subtle. That's why they're so hard to kind of contextualize, because if I'm on the receiving end of a microaggression, it's easy for me to say, I'm overreacting. Like, they didn't really mean that. And maybe they didn't. But when that happens to me over and over and over again, right? So that's the context of where I think racism lies today. Other thoughts?
I was going to say, a lot of times in my experience, it feels like it's a lot of ignorance that happens. It's not like they're intentionally trying to demean or say anything negative.
Yes.
Like they think that they're not being rude about it or anything, but it's very insensitive. They don't think it's insensitive because they don't really know. And
Right.
From my experience, like, I feel like if I say something, then it's like they think I'm overreacting, and then I feel like I'm overreacting. So I just kind of try to let it go.
It's like this psychological kind of battle, right? So here's the thing, when we learn that racial microaggressions are, and I would encourage you to read about racial microaggressions, is that my fear is that when we learn about it, that both parties will just shut down, right? Because if you're saying to me that sometimes I come across as ignorant, I'm gonna be like, well, then I just won't ever say anything, right? When in reality, that's perpetuating the problem. So be okay with having someone tell you, that kind of offended me, or let me tell you really what that made me feel like. Or I know you don't really know this, but let me tell you a little bit about my culture or where I'm from. And that is that moment that it breaks. That's a moment that moment of anxiety or frustration or anger breaks is when the other person or you say, I don't know if that came across right. Let me say that differently. Other thoughts? Yes, sir.
So you mentioned with racial microaggressions, which feels to me to be a true thing.
Yeah.
But it feels to be a very kind of interpersonal
Yeah.
way of seeing racism, and so asking about how racism exists.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on systemic racism?
Yeah.
Housing segregation,
Yeah.
things like that, criminal justice system.
Yeah. I think that we have two levels, and it's probably not just two, but there's two levels of racism that are occurring in our country today. We have no doubt that systemic racism is alive and well. I mean, let's look at what's happening in our prison system today. There is no doubt the new Jim Crow, right? That's that new book out right now that talks about the prison system and how so many of our men, particularly men of color, are going to be or will be housed in some sort of jail or prison system in their lifetime. Why is that? And so that's one obvious place we can look systemically. But what about things that we don't think about, like systemically? Like how about in the housing market? Or how about in the real estate market? Or how about getting loans? Or how about applying for a job? There's been a lot of research that's looked at when an employer is looking at two resumes and one name is apparently or obviously in their mind of a different racial ethnic background than white, there's kind of this implicit stereotyping that goes on. And so how does that play out? It's not that that employer is trying to discriminate, but the stereotypes that have been built up in his or her mind over their lifetime, it plays a role, and they might overpass that resume. It happens in how often people are being watched while they shop. Right? You've seen a lot of videos out there, shopping while black or shopping while Hispanic. I mean, those things, although they may seem small, when you put it onto a larger kind of systemic level, we notice that we continue to live in a society where the vast majority, disproportionately of the people that are incurring injustices are people of color. Why? Why is that? In 2015, why is that? So my thought on that, sir, is that systemic racism is oftentimes feels so big and so difficult to conquer. Yet we can focus on this interpersonal life that we live in. And we need to use our voices through legislation and through voting, and where we choose to live, and who we choose to hang out with, and what neighborhoods we choose to live in, and what churches we choose to go to, that can begin to break down some of those systemic issues. What are your thoughts on systemic?
How much time do we have? Are you familiar with Joy DeGruy? She's wrote
No.
Post-traumatic slave syndrome. She talks about how she teaches a course on post-traumatic slave syndrome and how it takes 10 weeks to get through this idea of race. And she condenses it into a 2-hour thing. She says she has this whole spiel that she did beforehand. But I feel like she says that there's a 100 level class and a 600 level class. The 100 level class is where you go in and you kind of make the case for systemic racism. It exists. Here's why. Here's the stats. Et cetera. The 600 level is where you go in and you start going. You've already assumed that that's true. Like you're not going to come in and say
That's not true.
That's not true. Or
Right.
is it true? You need to go back and take that 100 level class.
Right.
I think my thoughts kind of are when we talk about having conversations between people of color and white people.
Yeah.
I think people of color come into those conversations at a 600 level experientially.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I think that there may feel like, well, why can't we go there 600 level? Because that's where I'm at. That's my experience.
Yeah.
Like, I know that you haven't had that experience.
Yeah.
I know that you're still, but like this is where I'm at.
Yeah.
And so for you to question that, feels difficult.
Yeah.
I think that's kind of what I've heard from some students I've taught.
Yeah.
That's kind of their feeling. So.
Yeah, and so all the more reason to some extent for me as a white person to catch up, right? And to do so because, and not to do so out of guilt, but to do so because I want to bring God's kingdom to this earth, and I want to be in right relationship with people. And also because I want to be a part of the solution. I want to be a part of eliminating, or at least shutting down, the extent to which racism is alive and well. And I want to be a part of that. And I can't be a part of that until I take those classes and learn about it. So I think for white folks, especially, I can speak only from my own experience, but being in graduate school, I was just a baby in all this. And of course, when you're hearing it for the first time, you want to deny it. I did. Now again, I'm not saying all the white people in here are at that stage, but for me, I didn't want to know that that's true. Because what does that mean? If it's true, if it is really true, that people of color are disproportionately have lower incomes, disproportionately die earlier, disproportionately will spend time in jail, disproportionately have lower accumulations of wealth, then what does that mean for me? Right? It's like a race. I'm sorry, I'm a runner, I can't not go there. Because everything's like a race. Not really, but kinda. I want to believe in a world where the starting line is here, and every single person that's going to run this race is starting right here. And when the gun goes off and I start to run, that whoever wins, it's because they've worked harder, right? They've all had an opportunity to train, and they're all ready to run the race. So whoever wins, it makes sense that the person that's trained harder, might not be me, wins the race. I want to believe that that's true, that the starting line is the same. But when I actually wrap my mind around the fact that the starting line is not the same for all groups of people, and it has nothing to do with their personal choices, maybe a little, I mean, let's not completely take individual responsibility away from people, but usually the starting line is back here for some people because of educational discrimination, because of housing segregation, because of wealth and income inequalities. That's why the race is back here. So no matter how hard this person runs, she may never win. And so I don't really necessarily think I'm talking about let's have equality for all. I'm saying let's have equity, because what's equity? Equity is fairness. Equity is fairness. I don't think equality is, sorry, I'm cynical maybe, I don't know. I'm a sociologist. I don't think equality is possible until God comes back to this place and takes us away. But I do know that we can work towards equity, and we can do that through systemic change, and we can do it through micro interpersonal change. Other thoughts? Yes, ma'am.
I have a question. Sometimes in talking with other white people about this, students who are white but come from a lower class background
Sure.
have a really, like,
Yep.
they're like, I came from a,
Yep.
this is like stereotypical, but like, I came from a trailer park,
Yep.
single mom, like, what do you mean I have no privilege? You know,
Right.
and so there's a lot of feeling around that that's sometimes really hard to, like,
Yeah.
sort of own that white privilege, where there still is more access, obviously,
That's right.
but it's, do you have resources or conversation points that you can recommend to sort of unpacking some of that intersection?
Yeah, I think one thing that we have to recognize, and you just used the word kind of intersectionality. There's a wonderful piece, and it has a terrible name, but it's called The Matrix of Domination. The Matrix of Domination by Patricia Hill Collins. And she talks about this idea that all of us are not just our race, all of us are not just our gender, all of us are not just our social class. All of us are all of those. So let's I'll show you a diagram or a way in which she talks about this. Let's put in the center of this circle the word P, which stands for privilege. Okay, and then coming out from privilege, you have spokes on a wheel. And let's say we have things like our race and ethnicity. How about our gender? How about our level of ableism? Like, how able are we physically, right? Are we physically able? So able. What about our sexual orientation? What about our religion? What about our social class? And she says, here's what I want you to do. I want you to put a dot on these spokes in terms of how close you are to privilege. Okay, but your question should be, what's privilege? Privilege is based on what she calls the mythical norm. right? The mythical norm, the norm of that which is seen as the normal, the best, the most common individual, right? Who has the most power, who has the most privilege in this culture. She would say, and again, here's like when we're talking about race and ethnicity, when we start talking about gender as well, it becomes really easy for this to come across as male bashing, but it's not. Patriarchy is not about a man. Patriarchy is about a system that we're all a part of where male privilege exists, right? That doesn't mean that all men are scum or that all men are sexist. In fact, most men are not. But we live in a system where men tend to have more power. So what would that mythical norm look like? Describe that person to me, please. What is the mythical norm of that which is normal, that which is good?
Heterosexual.
Okay, so this person is straight. Yep. What else? White. Wealthy. Yep. Rich. Owns property. Male. Christian. What else? He's able-bodied. He's probably married, right? He probably has a career. He probably has 2.5 kids. What else?
Educated.
He's highly educated. He's probably really strong and good looking, right? There are norms that we have expectations of that which is beautiful for men and women, right? So he's probably strong, he's probably athletic. Now, do people like this exist? Yes. Do all people that look like this have a lot of power? No. But when we look at the media, when we talk about hegemonic masculinity or hegemonic race and ethnicity, this is the ruler, right? This is the measuring stick. So now take this idea and put yourself over here. Okay, so I am a woman. So in terms of the mythical norm, I'm going to be pretty far out here on my spoke. In terms of my race, ethnicity, I'm going to be really close. My social class, I'm middle, right? I come from a middle class family, and in light of what you were saying, maybe it's someone who's way out here. In terms of my religion, I am a Christian, so I'm going to be close. My sexual orientation, I'm straight, I'm going to be close. Able-bodied, I'm close. Connect the dots. Right? So for someone to say, look, I'm way out here in social class, so don't tell me that because I'm white, I've had it easy. Because I haven't. I struggle, and in fact, I'm just going to be blunt here, and because I'm white, I didn't get a scholarship. And one of my other friends got a scholarship because she's Native American. And that's not fair, right? But to put it into perspective, I think is really powerful. By saying you're poor doesn't deny that you're lacking in privilege there, but to look at other areas of our life. Now, think about someone who's right way out on the edges here. What is their life like? And again, this might not have anything to do with their personality or their choices. But what this relies on is it relies on this being true. It relies on this being the mythical norm. And here's the challenge for your generation, because your generation is the biggest generation we've ever seen. You're like 76 million. That's a lot. I don't know what was happening like 18 years ago, but something was going on with a little something, right? Your generation is the most racially ethnic diverse. You are the most social class in terms of diversity. You are, to some extent, your children will grow up in a world where white is no longer the numerical majority. So it is your job, please. It is your job to start changing this. And how do we change it? How do we change it? We start encouraging our young African American, Latina, Latinos, Asian American, etc. What about moving into politics? What about moving into business, right? What about all these ideas and thinking about what you can do with your life? You can't control, by the way, okay, this is a really bad analogy again. Think of a tree. all the leaves on the tree. You're a leaf. You fall off, you die, the tree still stands, right? Who cares about you? But the leaves do what for the tree as a whole? What do leaves do? Come on, I need my biology majors. Photosynthesis, right? Without your leaves, without all of you together, the tree would die. So you have to be okay with doing the work you need to do, knowing that you might not ever see the outcome of your hard work. Knowing that you're going to fall off and die, and you might not have changed the world, but in your own world, in your own way, what are you going to do? And the first thing I can tell my white brothers and sisters in this room, figure out what your racial ethnic identity is. Figure out where you come from. Figure out the ways in which your people, whoever your people are, what did they experience as they came from other parts of the country, other parts of the world to this country? Because most of our families, us white families, we didn't come from this place. We came here and we did some pretty awful things, and I'll own that. But first of all, white brothers and sisters, figure out your own story, and then recognize that even though you didn't ask for it, and even though you probably don't even feel it, there's something about being white that gives you privilege. And again, privilege accepted is responsibility accepted, right? It's not a punishment. Yes?
Just one quick comment for the person that asked about that. There's an article, it's not like a peer-reviewed, any kind of research necessarily, but on Huffington Post, there was an article on explaining white privilege to a broke white person, and they also
Yes.
have a link towards Peggy McIntosh.
Yes.
Article as well, so it's kind of all
Read that.
which is nice. But that's a good one.
It's a
to
great one.
Start with.
It's a person that lives in a trailer park, I think. Yeah. Says, I don't understand this white privilege thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
I have a lot of thoughts, but
Me too.
I'm a resident director now at Pepperdine, working with college students, and so and going to the same school. And so I went to I'm from Texas, so we
Yeah.
can talk about. But I went to a school very diverse, so I think that added to my I don't know. I felt like I accepted everybody, like I didn't have, but we didn't have that conversation. So
Right.
Number one, I think that's one. How do we have that conversation,
Yeah.
and when should we start, and
Yeah.
helping families know how to have that conversation.
Yeah.
And the next would be helping Christians, on the other able to have that conversation,
Right.
because it does connect with our faith, and that is what made me
Yeah.
accept others.
Yeah.
But then I learned that my family's not diverse and my church was not diverse, and so
Yeah.
the people that I was closest to were similar to me.
Yeah.
And then I went to Pepperdine, which at the time was way less diverse. We've worked on that, which I'm proud of,
Yeah.
actually. But 50%. I'm very
Wow.
happy about that. But as a resident director, what I've thought about lately, and actually it's because the guy who brought us here, Bryce, who works in our intercultural affairs office, does several things with RAs. But for me, he challenged me to think about who my friends were. And so to me, that's the next step. If
Yeah.
we're going to get to know, then we have to decide,
Yep.
like you said, where are we going to live and who our friends are going to be.
Yeah.
So this last year, Bryce was actually one that we worked on becoming friends together. And I would say he's the first, even though I would say I have friends of all different backgrounds.
Yeah.
But my closest, deepest,
Yeah.
share everything with,
Yeah.
it wasn't until 2 years ago that it was somebody not white.
Yeah.
So anyway, so I think that there's something there that we have to start. How do we have that
Yeah.
conversation? So those letters are good, but then it's like, how do we?
What do
is
we
the
do?
next step?
What's the
Now,
next step?
One thing I think that's helpful for the microaggressions is 35 dumb things well-intentioned people say, and it's the starter. I liked your 100 versus 600.
That's a really nice
We
analogy.
still have to
It's not
talk.
mine,
No, but I'm glad you brought that, because there are some of us that still need the 100 class. But at least for the RAs, what we did is put those up on the wall and at least start having those conversations. And we were talking about in the car, so it was ouch, snap, and what did I say? Oops. And so people would put on there, have you said it? Have you heard it said to you? And have you heard it said but you didn't do anything about it? So it kind of created that conversation, especially about the microaggressions.
Yeah.
So there were, anyways, so that's kind of what I think it was the start. We need to now do better at getting to the 600 class and really talking more deeply, but that was when I realized, man, yes, I am privileged because I'm a lot of those things. But I also think I'm trying to intentionally understand more and have better conversations.
Yeah. I think the way in which you just described yourself and the way in which you just described that intentional friendship is a perfect model of what I want to be doing in my life as a white person, and not seeking out friends that are different than me just so I can have a friend that's different than me, right? Because just because someone's different than me doesn't mean we're going to be great friends. In fact, it might even be harder to be great friends. And so you have to get over that initial reaction of, why are you wanting to be friends with me? Is it because I'm Asian? Is it because, right? So I think the first thing, though, is for me as a white person, and again, this is just Melanie, I have to be bold in starting conversations with people in a loving and humble way, and being okay with rejection, and sitting down at tables where I am the minority, and inviting myself, if I feel welcome, to enter into places, going to different churches, going to environments, choosing to live in a different neighborhood. Now I can do that, because I have the resources to choose where I live to some extent. Where do I live? Who do I hang out with? I mean, those are kind of simple things at somewhat of a level. And I think starting those conversations, in order to okay, here's all the stuff I put down in this letter, so now where do I go with that? I think having groups on campus that I just went to a university that has this session every month called Shut Up and Listen. It's called Shut Up and Listen. And the reason it's called that is they had a guest speaker come to the university, an African-American preacher, and a white kid. Said to him, so tell me, how do I start understanding? How do I become more aware of what's happening in this world around race and ethnicity? He says, all you got to do is shut up and listen. So every month, a group of students get together. They set kind of the ground rules of we're going to probably fall on our face and say some things that we don't really mean, but let's just have the freedom to do that, and let's just talk. And it's small, and it's gotten bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. Now it's packed. And it's not always about race and ethnicity. Sometimes it's about sexual orientation. Sometimes it's about gender, etc. But I want to do shut up and listens just on my own, right? I also think having a classroom, do you have classes on your campus? Do you have safe professors on your campus that are talking about these things? If you don't, tell your president that you need one. I'm kind of serious there. Talk to the multi-ethnic service people and say, we need a class on this. Maybe even a gen ed class. Because that will take me from 100 level in a class that I take, that will take me maybe to 200. And that'll take me to 300. And by the way, folks that are at 600, it's not their job to educate you. I've learned that. Some of my 600 level friends have been kind and done that for me, but I cannot expect them to be my educator. And I've had 600 level friends say, I'm tired of being an educator. And I understand that, right? So I think classes, intentionally just stepping out and being really uncomfortable maybe for those first few moments. What are other thoughts that you have of how do you start that? Yeah.
Well, I was wondering because in having these conversations, I think that there's a part of us that feels comfortable having an interpersonal conversation. But I found a little bit more hesitancy, especially among Christian friends, etc., about having the political conversation and the role that politics plays in this, and the role that who you vote for judge and who you vote for governor and who
matters.
You vote for, matters in this conversation.
Yeah.
And so people want to separate the two and say, well, let's have this conversation over here, but I still want to vote, a certain way over here. But this way of voting guess I usually have a rub there. I'm wondering
Yeah.
if you have any thoughts.
So how have you dealt with those situations?
I firmly I try to speak the truth.
Sure.
My truth, the truth that I live.
Yeah.
But I don't really know. I'm still trying to
Yeah.
work through the political ramifications of responsibility.
And I don't want to suggest that your speaking your truth isn't having an effect, because it is, and this isn't a cop-out, but like, I'm not probably going to be the one to change someone's political ideas. That has to be a decision that they make. But if I have spoken my truth and said, would you just listen to me for a second? This is where I'm coming from. I'd like to know where you're coming from. I mean, I think someone needs to be convicted in their heart that and believe that who they vote for has serious ramifications. And that might not be my job to convince them of that. So I want to alleviate that pressure of I gotta figure that out. Not to say that those conversations shouldn't happen, but particularly in the realm of politics, just like in the realm of learning about whiteness and racism, it has to start in your head, like you're saying, here's the facts. Here's the facts. Okay, here's the facts. Maybe that's the conversation starter. What are the facts? What do we know? Because that's not about me and you. That's just about the facts. And then what you see happening with people as they start to transition into kind of this bigger awareness, it starts to move from their head to their heart. And that's your relationships. And once I feel in my heart and I know in my head that something is true, I'm much more likely to act. And that might be through a series of people that have gotten me there. It might be a series of classes that have gotten me there. But every semester when I teach my class on race and ethnicity, I always start with the facts just to lay the groundwork. And then I start kind of doing what you're suggesting, what have you said? What have you heard? What have you not said? How have you been a victim? How have you been a perpetrator? And that's where people will either put up the wall and say, I'm not ready to go there, I'm not going to do that, or they're like, I'm gonna think about what is my role in this. I teach this stuff. I talk about this stuff. I write this stuff. And 2 years ago, I'm at my gym. And this woman comes in and she says to me, she's a white woman, she says, hey, Melanie, I remember you. And I'm like, I have no idea who you are. She's like, yeah, how are Caleb and Aiden? Those are my children. I'm like, how does this person know who my children are? And then I realized this was a woman that used to take care of my kids years and years before. And I said, so how have you been? Where have you been? She goes, well, I've lived down in Texas for the past couple years, but now I'm back in Oregon. I said, so tell me about that. And we were talking about exercise because we were in a gym. I said, tell me about the gym you went to, because I teach classes at the gym. She's like, well, I went to this one gym. And she kind of lowered her voice and she said, I just had to leave it after a while. A lot of Mexicans went to that gym and they smell like their food, and so I couldn't handle it anymore. And I just sat there. I just sat there. And I've been doing this for years. And I just sat there with a dumb smile on my face and said, yeah. She's like, all right, see you later. I'm just coming clean with my junk there. That was a perfect opportunity to say something, and I didn't. And I need to ask for forgiveness on that. And I didn't have to say something. But the minute she said it, I could feel that stirring in my heart of, Melanie, this is what you talk about. Are you going to stand up when it's uncomfortable? And why didn't I? It's because I didn't want to start something with this woman, but I just let it fly. And I have to come clean with that. It's a process. Yes, sir.
Okay, I'm going to have to apologize to everybody. I'm very East Coast. I have a very blunt way of saying everything, so please, I beg you, just bear with me.
I love it.
I'll just say this easily as I can. What incentives are there for privileged white people to even want to be a part of this? I'll give you an example. I go to Westmont. I'm the student body VP there. Christina, and I'm sorry, I forget your name. Natalia, I just went to Natalia yesterday. I'm sorry. They both go there. They're very involved. They're great. And a lot of the people coming down with us later today, they're not student leaders. Some are, some aren't. But a lot of people looking forward to having this conversation and working through it. But in a couple of my friends that I'm talking to, like leaders of specific clubs and et cetera, that I turn to and I go, hey, we're going to go down to this conference on racial reconciliation. They're like, yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
You should go and let us know what goes on down there. Let us know how we can work to continue to integrate it. And Jason Shaw, who's our intercultural leader, he's doing a session right now, actually. He's great. And then I talked to a couple of other people, and they turn to me and they go, what are you talking about? I said, well, we're doing this. I said, why are you doing that? Why are we pulling away from our, and I hate this phrase, traditional values?
Wow.
And it's not the first time I've heard it, though. And then I'm packing yesterday, and the same person comes into my room, and he's like, oh, yeah, no, we want to go to the Board of Trustees, and we don't want to have any big conversations on diversity, and we don't really want this kind of like a war to start over to where there's much more integration of diversity and talking about these topics. And it's even something I've ran into during the year in my role where I'm like, there can be a need for this to happen. And I mean, thankfully we've had our most diverse freshman class this year. We've been able to have a lot more conversations, so we're making progress, but it still sits in my mind where there's no major incentive for the white people at the very top to even want to acknowledge this conversation to begin with, and there's no pressure for them to have to do anything with it to change the system at all. So even in addressing microaggressions and addressing systemic issues, I mean, it seems like we can be organized and we can be knowledgeable all we want, but if there is no incentive for the people that are in power, both in general and politically, then what are we talking about? How do we incentivize them or make them feel that need to want to change?
That I'm so thankful you said that. Like, that's being really honest. And way to go, East Coast. I would love other thoughts on this. I'll just kind of share what my initial thoughts are. I have a president at my university who is really struggling with wanting to know why we want to increase diversity, right? He doesn't see the benefit of it because in his mind, not that it's not great to have all sorts of people, but that we just need more people. I don't care what color they are, we just need more people to come here. So I think the tactic that's been taken with our president and some of the upper division folks has been, this will actually help your bottom line. Okay, let's just talk money here for a moment. And I hate to go there, but it's true. You are missing out on an entire growing population that's been growing for the past 10 years. The largest growing incoming undergraduate demographic are Hispanic youth. If you don't tap into that, you're falling behind. So from a financial standpoint, right, not only when we increase the diversity on campus and we gather them, but then we retain them, you will have more students attracted to your institution. I mean, it's fact. It's been shown over and over again. Now, it's one thing to attract students. It's another thing to retain students, right? So we can get as many numbers here that we want. We can have a 30% whatever number, but if we're not keeping those students, and the way that we keep students and the way we keep them engaged and proud to be at whatever school it is we have people that look like them at the top, and we have professors that look like them. Because if I'm a woman and I go to a place where all the people in power are men, I might really respect them and learn a lot, but I don't envision myself being that way. So this is not about race, it's about leadership. It's about growing leaders and people that are proud to be a part of your institution. I think from a higher educational standpoint, it is truly, you can break it down to like, it's just gonna benefit you in your pockets. It really will. Okay, but beyond that, right? Beyond that, right, how do you like, incentivize this just for someone on a personal level, right? So I have some ideas, but I'd love to hear what you all think. What are some incentives to give to white people as to why we should care about this? Yeah.
I can't help but think of the incarnation and why, or Jesus, like putting himself in human form, putting on flesh because he cared about the suffering of humanity, which then compels us to, because statements like that, which I understand because I work at Biola in this largely white community that is trying really hard to get it, some days better than others, where
the statements like that are essentially saying, like, I don't have to care about the lived experience or sufferings of people of color, because for us, at the end of the day, I get to walk away from
Right,
this conversation, which for people of color and marginalized people groups, there's no putting it down,
Right.
there's no walking away from it,
Yeah.
there's no stopping to think about it.
Right.
And so, unfortunately, our churches have so failed to communicate that diversity and racial reconciliation isn't this weird, like, as if marriage was a traditional value and diversity wasn't, which is nuts. But that diversity is at the very heart of God.
Right.
And so we've failed to communicate that to our churches, and so we see it as this fringe conversation,
Yeah.
when truly it is God's heartbeat.
Yep.
And that when you have diverse people, groups of people in leadership, I think of women in particular, that study after study shows that when you have more women on boards of trustees or whatnot, or CEOs, and people of color, that company, that organization is going to be more successful because you're bringing varied life experiences and strengths to that table than
Right.
if everyone at that table looks like each
Right.
other. So we're all losing. White people are losing
Yeah.
out
Yeah.
because we are not tapping into the gifts of people who are not white.
Yeah. And then I want to hear your comment. I would also say, what did Chad say this morning? Here's the reality. Like, when you leave this place, your cultural intelligence, unless you have it, you won't thrive in the marketplace. You won't thrive in the business place. You won't thrive in your communities, because the reality is that you need to have that cultural intelligence in order to kind of move up the ladder. I mean, and you can even put it as simply as that. Like, the marketplace that you're moving into will be culturally diverse. Will be. That's the reality. Statistically, check out the US Census. I mean, it's true. And so do you want to have that cultural context, that cultural intelligence level, so that let's say you're a social worker and you're dealing with families. Let's say you are a business person or a marketing person. You're going to have to understand different cultures in order to bring the business to your company. I mean, that is, to me, when he said that this morning, it's absolutely true. It doesn't even have to be that I like it. It's just the reality. So it's like going to school. I better be prepared for my job. I better be prepared for a diverse cultural marketplace. Yes, sir.
Yeah, so I agree completely with everything that's just been said. I think it all comes down to two things: questions and commonplaces. Commonplaces being like figuring out what is this person's bottom line.
Yeah.
If it's money or business, then talk with them and interact with them in terms of money and business. If they're an educational institution and it's knowledge and not academic reputation, then do the knowledge and academic reputation. Diversity enhances knowledge, and if you want all of your students to grow inside their knowledge and understanding of the world, then one of the best ways to do that is to saturate your campus with diverse individuals who can bring diverse perspectives to allow people to engage with various thoughts and ideas. If somebody's commonplace is Christ, if they're claiming to be Christians, then you use that commonplace of Christ and say, like, look, Jesus' prayer was that we would be known, that we would be one. His prayer is that we would be one and that they would know that we are Christians by our love. How can we say that we're loving one another when we're ostracizing different individuals by treating them poorly on the basis of the color of their skin or on the basis of their culture? But you've got to, like, in order to find out what their commonplaces are, you have to ask questions. You have to understand them. You have to understand where they're coming from and what their bottom line is. And once you find out what that is, you can start to ask questions of, if X is what you say you care about, and if X really is what you care about, then how can we not do X, Y, and Z, or Y and Z, if what we're caring about is X? Because what motivates people in the end is it changes from person to person based on what it is that they want, and you've got to show them that if you want this specific thing, then the best way to get to that outcome is by following this path. So you've got to have questions in order to find out their competencies.
Let's just go home now. Yeah. Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
Kind of touching on the second part of your question as a Christian, I have a question on how, when you're saying that we need to work in our generation to change this mystical form, how do we implement established as a norm in the way that he's created us into changing this, because if it's based off of what I individually think is normal, and then I have to agree that whatever my friend Melissa thinks is normal, then our norms will be different, and this norm will be a train wreck.
Right. That's a
How
really...
do these believers step into that conversation socially, maybe beginning in like a Christian setting, since a global setting is a religious community?
Yeah, I mean, do you think that Christ would say that's Christ, my guess is Christ would not say that's the goal, right? Christ would say, this does not reflect my ministry. This does not reflect who I hung out with. This doesn't reflect what I was trying to do while I was here on earth. This is not, I didn't just die for this person, right? I didn't just give up my life for this person. I did for this person, but not just this person. So I think acknowledging that this is one type of person. And so how do we transform that to be more reflective of God's entire character? God's entire character is, again, all variations of this. So where in the Bible can we look that says that Christ is really pushing this idea that I'm not just here for one person, neither Jew nor Gentile, right? Neither male nor female, neither circumcised or not circumscribed. Like, who am I here for? We have so much evidence of that, particularly in the Gospels. Just that acknowledgement kind of like eliminates the tension I might have with someone else's norm, right? Thoughts? Yeah. Yes, sir.
I think it's easy to kind of miss the point or miss the big picture of diversity when I look at a scripture like Colossians 3, like you mentioned, circumcised, uncircumcised.
Yeah.
I know that it's talking about like putting on the new self in Colossians 3, and so I think what Paul is trying to emphasize in something like that is it's not what we are, it's who we are.
Yeah.
And when I read that, I just think that so often we get defined by the color of our skin, we get defined on the culture that we come from, when really that's not what we are. Who we are is like Christ is all and is in all.
Yes. Yes.
And so rather than emphasizing, and this is going to come across blunt, but rather than emphasizing diversity, why are we not emphasizing the character and who we are rather than what we are? Not negating where we come from, but really emphasizing that if we have Christ in us, it doesn't matter if we're circumcised or uncircumcised, Jew or Greek, slave or free.
Yeah.
If we are in Christ, then really that is the pinnacle of who we are.
And I would say that is absolutely true, but we need to juxtapose that in a culture that we live in that's broken. Right? We live in a culture where it does matter. And we don't live in a culture where we can subscribe to colorblindness yet. We cannot live what Martin Luther King said, that it shouldn't matter the color of your skin, but the content. That's the goal. That's what God's saying, right, in Colossians, that this is who we are. This is who I made you to be. But we live in a cultural context where people are judged by the color of their skin. They are judged by their gender. They are judged by their religious backgrounds. So ultimately, we have to work within that context and challenge that context. That's why racial reconciliation, I believe, and understanding whiteness is very important, because we don't live in that world yet.
And what's that passage in Revelation, I think, that talks about the cultures that will be a part of heaven?
Yes, Revelation 5, 9, and 10.
You know, that just talks about part of this world, in a sense, will be part of the
Right.
the everlife, or afterlife, whatever. And so, just thinking through, there's part of this culture that is like good and true and beautiful.
Yeah.
And that we sort of miss a little bit of who God is by
Yeah.
not always seeing some of like those differences.
Right. That's why when I say to my friend who's Asian, when I would say to her, I don't see the color of your skin. I just see you, and I see the beauty that God made you to be. And ever so kindly and gently, she says, how can you not see the color of my skin? And she doesn't mean it literally, but she means, but when I look in the mirror, I don't just see a person, I see an Asian person, right? Because I'm reminded of that more often than not. And I think that's not meant to make me feel bad, but that's meant to say, it does matter today. It does matter. And I can relate to that as perhaps a woman, or as a poor woman, or as someone who's struggled with able-bodiedness or whatever. Like, we all can relate. We all have a part of our identity. We've all experienced, to some extent, a type of discrimination, have we not? To some extent, no matter, we've all been stereotyped, haven't we? Listen to this sentence and fill it in. I am a blank, but I'm not a blank. And what that sentence, when you fill in the words into that sentence, I am a blank, but I'm not a blank, what that suggests is that you have a sense of your identity that people have misconstrued or seen you a certain way. I am a feminist, but I don't hate men. Right? I am a Christian, but I'm not a Bible thumper. We can all relate to that idea of experiencing that. So when she says to me, Mel, how can you not see my color? It'd be like her saying to me, I don't see you as a woman, I just see you as a being. Well, but I am a woman, and that means something. I am a blank, but I'm not a blank. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to say with Colossians 3, or at least I think it's Colossians 3 where it's talking about there's neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, so on and so forth. I don't think it's talking about how these things don't exist, because they do exist. I think what Paul was getting at is these things are no longer barriers for us. It's no longer that we're saying because you're Greek and because I'm a Jew, we can't interact with one another. Or because I'm male, because you're female, like we can't talk about theological things. But it's saying like, you know what? There aren't these barriers when it comes to Christ. These things aren't barriers to our unity. In fact, this unity isn't coming from this uniformity of all of us Jews getting together, or all of us males getting together, and so on and so forth. But there's this unity and diversity that isn't, there's no longer this separation between us because of these things that normally would divide us. But we're going to come in together and we're going to celebrate Christ together because we're finding unity even in the midst of celebrating the diversity that's between us.
Yeah.
So I think that's part of what Paul was getting at in Colossians 3.
Any other thoughts or questions? Why don't you take a moment and on a piece of paper or whatever, write out, fill in that sentence for me. I am a blank, but I'm not a blank. Take a moment just to think about that. Thank you for thinking about that for a moment. And I would encourage you to share that sentence or statement with someone that you trust, maybe even someone that you'd like to get to know. Maybe that's a conversation starter for someone that is very different than you. And sometimes it's great to be bold, and sometimes it's great to start a conversation in a way that just kind of lays it all out. I think I want to conclude today by saying, let's say that we understand the virtual kind of invisibility that whiteness affords some folks, some white folks. I don't think that's enough. It's not enough just to see these things or think about them or come to appreciate what whiteness means. Although that it's important, that's not the end. We're still at 100 level if we just recognize it. I think rather it's what we do with that knowledge and understanding that matters. If I understand that I'm privileged, yet fail to challenge that, if I understand that I'm privileged, yet fail to acknowledge it or to stand up when I hear an example like I did in the gym that day, what good is my insight? If I, despite discrimination, and I despise it, but I fail to speak against it, what have I done to rectify the injustice? My husband and I, every New Year's, we try and be in some place new. It's a hard task when you've been married a long time. But in 1999, Y2K, right, the world's going to explode. We decided, we were living in New York at the time, we decided that we would go to D.C. and spend New Year's Eve, Y2K, on the mall there in D.C. It was crazy. Snipers everywhere. I mean, it was probably like the safest place to be, maybe. Felt bizarre. Thousands and thousands of people came to hang out on the mall that day and celebrate the ringing in of the new millennium. And I remember the countdown, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2. Everyone held their breath. We're all going to explode. Nothing happened, right? But it was a magnificent experience. And I remember walking back to the subways after that and just looking around. Everyone's kind of just shell-shocked, like, wow, we just witnessed history, right? But that wasn't the most eventful experience I had in DC that weekend. The most eventful experience is when I went to the Holocaust Museum in Washington, DC. If you ever get a chance to go, it's very profound. And the way that the museum is set up is very significant. How many of you have been there before? Do you remember as you enter it, you walk down in a circle, you walk down, down, down into the ground, and you're given a name or a picture or something like that of a person who lost their lives or maybe did it during the time of the Holocaust. And you finally, when you get to the bottom, you find out what happened to that person. It's remarkable, it's meaningful, it's sad, it's awful, and it's eye-opening. That wasn't even the best part. The best part was as I was leaving that museum, and there's a gate that you walk under. And inscribed in that gate it says this: "Thou shalt not be a perpetrator, thou shalt not be a bystander, and thou shalt not be a victim," right? I think I don't want to be a bystander anymore, because my silence about whiteness does no one any good. It doesn't do me good. In fact, it ruins me inside. It destroys me inside when I don't recognize and talk about that. So I want to encourage you, whether you're white or not, self-identify as white, whether you're bi or whatever, please be bold and don't be scared like all my students have been in their letters. Try and start a conversation. And my guess is all that fear will go away, because it's fear, and fear is really based on, to some extent, the unknown. So I want to encourage you, as those in here that are white and self-identify as white, talk to someone else that's white about this. See what they think about this. And surround yourself with people that are willing to have these uncomfortable conversations. And for my brothers and sisters of color in this room, I want to thank you to some extent, because you represent to me the people that have walked into my life and challenged me. And have said to me, Melanie, I don't need your help, right? Because I wanted to help. I wanted to fix things. And the people that came alongside me said, I don't need your help. I'm fine. But I need you to understand yourself.
Biola University offers a variety of biblically centered degree programs, ranging from business to ministry to the arts and sciences. Visit biola.edu to find out how Biola could make a difference in your life.